February 25th, 2022. This was the release date of FromSoft's new open world title known as Elden Ring. At this point, I wasn't extremely familiar with all the Souls titles. My first ever Souls game was Dark Souls 3, but I never actually ended up beating it. When I was giving it my first run through, I actually got really stuck and frustrated, so I just stopped playing for a while, but eventually went back to it. The farthest I ever managed to get was to the Abyss Watchers, and that's about as far as I remember, but I never actually completed that fight. But after a while, I started Dark Souls 1. I honestly don't think I've ever in my life felt more lost playing a video game until I picked up the first Dark Souls. And that's not completely a bad thing. At the point of making this video, the farthest I've ever reached has been in Orlando. So I am no Souls vet by any means, but I've definitely had my fair share of experience. So what was Elden Ring like for me then? In all honesty, I really hadn't been following the game at all. At that point in time, I really wasn't playing any other games. So I thought, you know what? Sure, let's give it a shot. And trust me when I say it did not disappoint. For the purposes of this video though, I'll be going through New Game Plus 9. Although occasionally throughout the video, I will be mentioning my first experiences with the game as well. This video will primarily focus on story bosses and any bosses that contain a remembrance. I will definitely be providing a general view of everything I do throughout the game, but keep in mind that different builds can vastly change how the game is played, so I can only really speak from my experiences. So I thought there was no better way than to use the same character I used for my first playthrough throughout the game. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my first ever playthrough was an archer build. So now that you have an idea of how horrible this playthrough is going to be, let's get to our first boss fight. So ignoring the fact I actually managed to fall off the cliff here, we are going to move on to our next location. We are off to a great start. After a little bit of running, we open the first doors and enter Limgrave. I really cannot state how visually stunning this game is every step of the way. When you first open those doors and just see the world that is lying out in front of you, there's just so much to explore and take in. The art team truly did an amazing job. But enough just standing around and looking at the scenery. It is time to fight everyone's favorite tree sentinel. My first ever time fighting this boss, I actually tried to hide in the nearby church, but that didn't go over very well. He quite literally started to destroy the walls around me and turn them all into rubble. So that was when I learned hiding was not an option. This time though, we were fighting the tree sentinel head on. The first thing I noticed when trying to fight this boss was, as soon as I tried to fire an arrow at him, he put up his magical shield. Going through this game with a bow build, I kind of knew this was going to be a sign of what's to come. But overall, I really liked this fight. Whether you choose to fight on foot or on horseback, it is definitely a good early area boss to kind of show you how the game and other fights may work down the line. So the tree sentinel gets a good rating from me. Now we make our way to Morgott. This was the fight people started memeing on Elden Ring for its delayed attacks. Once you have like a decent timing down, Morgott really isn't that bad, it's just his delays are so ridiculous. He'll do an over the shoulder attack or even stay up in the air for a few seconds waiting to slam back down. I do kind of wish the area we fought him in was a little bigger, it can feel a little claustrophobic, but this boss is definitely not where the trend of delayed attacks ends. Overall, he's a fine boss fight, it just feels like the game is trying to go out of its way to trick the player. I managed to run my way through the Stormveil Castle while also getting harassed by a bunch of birds. I always forget the back route to the Stormveil Castle, so I end up just running straight through the troll's legs just trying to get to the boss fight. We're going to stick with what we know. I do like the themes and overall story behind this character. Someone that is so obsessed with the idea of power they will do absolutely anything to gain it. But back to the actual fight itself. The area was fun to work around, giving you options to hide from some of Godfrey's long-range attacks, but in the same sense it feels like it really works against the boss here. He would seem to get stuck, but having the ability to hide behind cover was satisfying. His wind projectiles were a little weird to dodge, but they weren't too bad. One thing I never noticed before was that his whirlwind will actually block arrows, which is definitely fine for a boss fight. I just kind of felt like the animation didn't really sync up with the timing, so there would be times that I would shoot and there would be no wind around him, yet my arrows would still get deflected. His second phase wasn't too much different, just some fire attacks here or there. Overall, a fine boss, he just felt a tad bit too easy. After our lovely encounter with the Grafted Lord ourselves, we actually make our way to Liurnia. This is a good second to talk about the world design. When you first open up to Limgrave, you have this vast area to explore as much as you want, but entering the Stormveil Castle, the path can seem a little more linear. But when you first reach the cliff sides of Liurnia, you still realize there is so much to explore. I just kept constantly asking myself my first playthrough, how much bigger is this map going to get? It is never ending. The only real downside here is realizing how much running around you have to do. And I feel like a lot of areas restrict the use of Torrent a little too much. After finding the key to the academy, we make our way in. I wish the worst to these guys at the top of the stairs, by the way. But after that pain and suffering, we end up coming across the Red Wolf of Radagon. I'd be lying if I said this boss didn't kill me. But that's my fault, I guess, for wearing armor with the poise of a paper plate. But overall, this boss has a really cool design. You can't go wrong with a red wolf with a sword in its mouth. He does jump around a little bit more than what feels necessary, and he'll sometimes throw out this really quick bite attack that doesn't really feel reactable. But overall, I would say I like this boss. As you keep progressing, you'll eventually run into the Carrion Knight. This enemy isn't too bad overall, depending on your type of build. This right here is where an archer build becomes tricky though. When fighting any human type enemies, they have the habit of dodging every single arrow you fire, so I basically had to end up trading blows to kill this man. But now we finally reach the Queen Renala. Let me say how much I really love this fight cinematically, but I hate that run back just as much. Even unlocking the shortcut for this area, it still takes way too long. And I understand the lore reasons for why there's no Stake of Marika about, but it would sure come in handy. But anyway, back to what I was saying. This fight is debatably one of my favorites cinematically. Just knowing that Renala's rebirth is the reason the students act the way they do is just so eerie, and I love it. And when entering the second phase, the way Renala's daughter Rani rushes to protect her, making sure that no harm comes to her mother. Renala, who was once a carrion magic prodigy, now needs to be protected by her own daughter, all while protecting with her life the last thing Radagon gave her. So I definitely love the lore and story behind this fight and how the queen herself became so vulnerable. But I can't sing all the same praises for the fight itself. The first phase of the fight is a puzzle of sorts. Certain scholars around the room will gain a ring of light. You have to attack them to further damage Renala's shield. If you manage to do this enough while also dodging the books and fire and chandeliers, you are then able to attack Renala directly. This fight, once you know the gimmick, is just a little too straightforward in my opinion, and for the most part, that's all I really have to say about it. Things are pretty different though once you hit the second phase. First off, I love the arena for this fight. When it comes to a boss battle, this has to be the coolest set piece in the entire game. Aside from the visuals though, Renala's spells felt like they were a little too easy to avoid this time around. Granted, I was playing a ranged character, but I didn't really feel like she had much of a chance of killing me. This could also be my familiarity with the fight coming in, but unfortunately I'd have to say the fight overall was pretty easy. Moving on though, we now make our way to Radahn. The unfortunate part about accessing Radahn's fight is you have to collect both the left side and the right side of the medallions. This on more than one playthrough just ends up feeling like a big chore, especially when you want to just get to the next fight. But we continue on. Before I talk any more about the fight itself, I definitely want to touch on Caelid a little bit. I really appreciate how different the areas are aesthetically throughout Elden Ring. There's the golden hue shining throughout Limgrave, the cold blue of Liurnia, the dark red of Caelid. They are so impressively distinct from each other. So every area I end up going to feels very memorable in of its own right. But now, making our way back onto Radahn, if you guys are like me and fought pre-patch Radahn, you'll probably remember how hard he was. It had to have taken me at least over 20 attempts to beat one boss. I remember my first playthrough actually, he was so weak and I had just run out of arrows and started to panic, so I pulled out whatever sword I had in my inventory and just started running at him, but luckily one of the summons came in clutch and finished him off. I really like this character's design and lore. There's something just so exciting seeing one of these powerhouse type characters come to the battlefield and just able to take down anyone that comes across their path. So that is definitely a point for Radahn in my book. The thematics with being able to summon a bunch of other warriors to help you out to take down this one huge enemy, this really makes it feel like a boss fight, but one that's on like a whole nother level. Overall, I really enjoy Radahn and enjoy getting to fight him again, but I do think some of his delays are pretty ridiculous. But other than that, I love the character, love the design, enjoy the fight for the most part and the thematics of it. I give Radahn a pretty solid rating. He is definitely going to be a very memorable experience for me. We now managed to take down a lot of the beginning shard bearers. Now we have to fight our way through Altus Plateau. Before being able to progress into the capital though, we have to take down the Draconic Tree Sentinel. I actually really enjoy my fights against these guys. For the most part, they feel pretty honest across the board. My only real issue with this boss happens to be the fireball when you go to heal. It feels like this enemy's timing is just a little bit too much of a coincidence. Other than that, I don't really have too much more to say. Now we finally managed to enter the royal capital. I continue to be a fan of the contrast of visuals all the way throughout the game. This is kind of like our fifth big area and still things are so drastically different from one another. The art team did a great job in making sure if you just held up a color palette of that specific area, you'd know exactly what you're looking at. But now making our way through the capital, we stumble upon our first look at the first Elven Lord. I'm going to hold off on a lot of my opinions until we reach Godfrey proper, but let me just say, fighting this boss in such a small room was absolutely horrible. Now we reach the throne room and have our rematch with Morgott. The first thing I hate to say that his habit of delaying his attacks carries over throughout both fights. Between the javelin throw to his leap attack, it just feels like they're trying to throw the player off a bit too much. But his high agility definitely makes the fight feel a lot more exciting. It really makes you feel like you're having this important duel. It seems to me that a couple small things hold this fight back from being great, but overall, not too bad. We defeat Morgott and try to head up the stairs, but we see we are blocked by thorns. It is now time to reach the mountaintop of the giants. We raise the medallion, yada yada yada. On my treacherous journey across the bridge, I got shot by the golem because I did not have my headset on, further proving I've got no maidens. Before we go to fight the fire giant though, I decided to make a couple detours. I collected half of the Halictri medallion from the village of Albinarix. Then I proceeded to fight the veteran boss to get the other half. This boss's design is solid. It is just a shame though that you see the same boss in Caelid before. This time around, the boss's first phase proved to be way more challenging than the second. Due to me using a bow, I had trouble taking down either of the knights at all. So after a few failed attempts, what I ended up opting to do was I just ended up running around the knights in circles, taking pop shots at the boss. I eventually succeeded in dwindling down the boss's health bar, receiving the other side of the medallion. And now we finally reached the fire giant. When I tell you guys I have such a burning, passionate hate for this boss fight, it can't even be understated. For me, this boss fight is always something I'm dreading, and I just hope I don't get stuck on for a while. I really just don't find any enjoyment in this fight personally, which is really unfortunate. For starters, his snow tidal wave attack is just really hard to dodge, and it becomes very frustrating trying to figure out that timing. The distance between you and the boss definitely feels like you should be using Torrent, but it makes it so hard when you can just get knocked off so easily. When you do manage to get close to the fire giant, you really can't even tell what he's doing due to having such a large model. In all honesty, he doesn't even fit in his own arena. What I mean by that is, this fight can be a little glitchy. If the boss rolls to a certain part of the arena, he will half be floating, half be standing on solid ground. This makes it extremely awkward trying to read his attacks and also attack him yourself. And out of any Souls game I've ever played, I don't think I've ever remembered a boss running away from me so much. It just becomes too much of a chasing game in the first phase. Now there are definitely some big issues with the second phase as well. They will try and have you focus either on his hands or his eye, but none of these targets are even really reachable through the standard flow of combat. During majority of the second phase, I ended up using the Ash of War enchanted shot. This meant I could keep at a good range, dodge some attacks, and definitely manage to hit some of those weak points that are usually a little unreachable. And let me just say, going through the boss this time, this is the first ever time I have ever seen this boss intentionally move towards me. And I've had to have beaten this guy at least like 9-10 times by now. So long story short, I can't stand this boss, I never want to fight him again, and I was very happy to have beaten him my first try. Now after managing to burn the Erd tree down with Melania's help, not Melania, her name is Melina, but my point still stands, we let it burn. This gives us access to the area of Farmazula, and also unfortunately gives us access to the Godskin duo. At this point in the game, we were doing my two least favorite boss fights back to back. When I first fought these two, I didn't actually know there was a summon available, and it was absolutely horrible. I needed my friend's help to beat it. They just do not perform well together as one boss fight. I don't want to spend too much time on these guys, but just know they tend to throw the fireballs every time you try to heal, so that kind of sums up how this fight likes to treat you. But going from two of my least favorite boss fights in the game, we actually come up on one of my favorites in the entire game, being Malekith. I understand this fight has a lot of mixed opinions, and I totally get that. But have you seen his design? On a more serious note though, yes, Malekith is actually one of my favorites, but it took me ages to beat him my first time around. This time though was actually a lot easier. I did fail to dodge his flurry attack once or twice and didn't get the hang of it again by the end of the fight, but he wasn't that bad at all. Having range attack options definitely helped. I understand this boss likes to jump around a little bit too much, but I can at least appreciate this boss having patterns that you can eventually learn to read pretty well. I like the openness of the arena, and I like the ability to hide behind the pillars if you really feel like you need to, and I actually think his character design holds up really well. To sum it up, I actually really enjoy this fight. Malekith is definitely one of my favorites, and whenever I've done a playthrough in the past, I'm always looking forward to rematching him. But don't you worry, my fun was cut short real quick when I remembered I have to fight Gideon again. This guy is also one of my least favorite bosses. I feel like the game honestly punishes you too much if you don't beat him the first try. Starting off the fight, you get to run up to him while he monologues and you get some free hits in. But if you don't manage to beat him and you end up losing, then every time you enter that boss room from here on out, he will continuously hit you with spells from afar. Because I used a bow in my first playthrough, this fight was absolutely horrible, and it held up this time around too. This man is over here shooting Kamehamehas, and I'm over here like, you have failed this city. It just doesn't really stack up that well for me. So I ended up having to play a waiting game. Otherwise, he would continuously roll around dodging all of my shots. The one thing I definitely had to look out for was his one comet attack. That thing does so much damage to me that it was my only fear for the entire fight. I am glad to be over with this boss again. But now it is time for our first proper encounter with Godfrey. I started out the fight like any other player would, any sane player that is, by running away. Eventually, that idea failed, but overall this fight is a lot more manageable now that we have such a wider space. It's honestly hard to get a read on Godfrey's patterns because he really changes them up. He may do a stomp and then attack, or he may stomp and just stand there and do nothing at all without any huge cues to kind of tell you what he's going to do. It definitely took me a while to get used to his first phase again, but eventually it was just whittling down his health to fight Horaloo. In his second phase, he completely gives in to his bloodlust. But that's honestly kind of what makes this fight in total really fun. Not only during his second phase, but you definitely feel like you're fighting a warrior that really knows what he's doing. And that right there is what makes this boss fight so fun to me. But back to the ins and outs of Horaloo. This guy is scary. Like, he has full intent to just snap my back. This boss is just so threatening and I love it, but he definitely has some issues. It just feels like you never really get to take a break. He does combos of like 10 attacks in a row, so you never really feel like you have an opportunity to heal too much. My main gripe with this boss though is how delayed his command grabs are, which, if I managed to get caught, actually ended up one-shotting me. My first time fighting this boss, I had so much trouble trying to dodge his earth attacks, but after you learn you can simply jump over them, it becomes way easier. I really love this boss in concept though, very frustrating in execution. Now usually up next would be Radagon and the Elden Beast, but I decided to save that for a little later. I want to beat all the other bosses first and save those two for last. So due to me not wanting this video to get too long, this is going to be split into two parts. Part 2 is going to be me finishing off the rest of the shard bearers and also actually beating the game. So thank you so much to everyone for watching. My name is Gambit and I will see you next time.